Spoiled alien girl, said I was her slave, but now she's on her knees for me. It started with the echo of boots on cold stone floors, a rhythmic cadence that sent a slight tremor through the silent corridors. The palace halls were fashioned from pale stone that shimmered faintly whenever torchlight fell across them. And even though everything about this place seemed regal and untouchable, I felt the weight of vulnerability seep through the cracks. My name is Rylan Voss, and at that moment I was a prisoner in chains. My wrists chafed against the dull metal, a constant reminder of my status. My hair hung in limp, dark strands across my face, an unintentional veil between me and the eyes that watched my every move. Soldiers, wearing dark attire with metallic trim, marched on either side of me, their bodies tense, as if expecting an attempt at escape at any second. I would have tried too if there was any point. But I'd learned the hard way that sometimes life doesn't offer an easy path to freedom. A day earlier, at least I thought it was a day, the concept of time was muddled under captivity. I had been caught in the aftermath of a failed uprising. That memory still burned like acid in my chest. My crew and I had believed we could infiltrate the main tower, sabotage the Dominion security grid, and give people a fighting chance. Instead, everything fell to ruin. My friends were either dead or gone, and I was here, sold into servitude to the royal family of this planet. I swallowed the bitter taste of self-reproach as the corridor opened into a wide, domed chamber. Torches flickered along tall marble columns carved with swirling patterns, reminiscent of cosmic tides. Everything smelled faintly of incense and polished rock. A figure stood in the center of the space, a woman with flawless posture, her lithe form draped in a tight black garment that seemed both regal and predatory. Her hair was sleek, dark, and impossibly long, trailing down her back. But under the flicker of fire, I noticed something peculiar in the subtle sheen of that hair, like the faint edge of a violet reflection whenever she turned her head. Her skin glowed with quiet brilliance, not in an overtly alien manner, but as if certain veins or patterns beneath the surface pulsed with a hidden energy. Her eyes were an otherworldly combination of sapphire and lilac, shifting with each tilt of her head. Those eyes fixed on me with a cool sort of dismissal. This was Princess Avari Xyn'Valeth, I realized at once, heir to the Xyn Dominion, known for her arrogance and rumored psionic gifts. She looked every bit the spoiled, dangerous royal. The guards propelled me forward until I was at the center of the room. Here I could see her face more clearly, the sharp cheekbones, the graceful slope of her jaw, and lips that curved into the faintest trace of a sneer. She lifted a slender hand, and I caught a glimpse of those unnaturally long, elegant fingers. The nails appeared translucent and dark, shimmering like polished onyx. She stared at me for a moment, letting the silence drag on. In that hush, I felt the press of her presence in a more literal sense. My scalp tingled as if her psionic aura was brushing against my mind. "You are the rebel who thought he could challenge us," she said, voice low, but carrying an echo in the domed space. It wasn't a question. She looked me over, noticing the thin line of scar across my jaw, the bruises on my arms, the scuffed soldier's boots. I was a trophy at her feet, battered but still defiant. "I'm Rylan," I replied, voice rough from lack of water. "That's all you need to know." Her gaze narrowed. I saw something flicker across her expression. Amusement or annoyance, I couldn't be sure. She raised her chin and addressed a guard in a bored tone. "Is he the only one left from that pathetic uprising?" "Yes, Your Highness," the guard responded. "His companions perished or disappeared." She turned back to me. "Well, Rylan," she said, almost drawling my name, "you belong to me now." The finality of her words made me bristle. I jerked my hands against the shackles in a futile attempt to keep my dignity. "I don't belong to anyone," I spat, the bitterness in my words matching the sting in my wrists. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Insolent, but I suppose humans like you don't understand your place in the Dominion." She gestured dismissively, and the guards escorted me out of the chamber. I had little time to absorb the grandeur around me as we moved. My blood simmered with humiliation. I'd failed my people, lost my friends, and now I was effectively property. The twisted irony tasted vile. I was taken through more corridors, stone archways that opened onto balconies showing a view of the night sky beyond. This world's constellations were strange. I could see faint dust clouds and the glimmer of a fractured moon in the distance. The air here was cool, carrying a hint of minerals that left a metallic tang in my nose. The environment was undeniably beautiful, but I felt none of its allure. All I could think about was the chain around my neck and the sneering face of the alien princess. At last, I was brought to a small chamber at the palace's periphery. This was to be my living quarters, if one could call it that. A plain bed, a basin of water, a place to store clothes. A single window faced a courtyard lined with strange vegetation that looked vaguely like twisted driftwood sprouting silky black leaves. The guard unshackled me, then left without a word, slamming the door behind him. I sank onto the bed, my entire body weighed down by fatigue. I pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes, trying to quell the throbbing headache that had been my constant companion since I was captured. Sleep came in fits that night, haunted by memories of the mission, of the fleeting hopes we'd had. I would drift off, see my fallen comrades, then jolt awake, heart pounding with leftover adrenaline. My mind was a storm of regrets and strategies. I might have been forced into servitude, but I wasn't about to accept it. There had to be a way out. Even if that meant biding my time, I would find the cracks in this fortress, exploit weaknesses, and eventually break free. In the quiet darkness, I laid out half-formed plans, not yet knowing where to begin, but driven by a stubborn refusal to remain a pawn in someone else's game. Morning dawned, or what passed for morning under this alien sky, with a pale silver glow filtering through the high window. The door to my room opened unceremoniously, revealing a tall figure dressed in the same soldier's gear as before. He tossed a bundle of clothes in my direction. "Princess's orders," he said. "You're to attend to her. Wear these and be presentable." I unfolded the garments. A dark vest, neatly stitched trousers, and boots that looked more ornamental than functional. I bristled but held my tongue. Getting on Princess Avari's bad side immediately wouldn't help me. As I dressed, I noticed the clothing was comfortable enough, though tailored in a style foreign to me, with tight wraps around my calves and subtle designs along the seams. At least the boots fit well. Once ready, I followed the soldier through the labyrinth of corridors. We arrived at a spacious hall that opened onto a terrace, where I saw her standing, silhouette framed by the radiant sky. She wore a similar black exosuit, though how it shimmered in the sunlight was mesmerizing, revealing subtle lines of color beneath the surface. Those faint, vein-like patterns on her exposed arms shifted with her every breath. She looked out over the courtyard, one hand pressed lightly against her sternum, as if she was trying to calm or ground herself. When the soldier announced our arrival, she turned, her eyes again fixed on me, scanning me from head to toe. I tensed, waiting for some dismissive remark. "So you cleaned up nicely," she said, inclining her head, voice laced with condescension. "But your posture still reeks of defiance." I couldn't help responding. "Apologies for not bowing low enough, Your Highness." A small sneer curved her lips. "You humans, so brash. Fine, let's see how you handle yourself under true pressure." She waved for me to follow, and we traversed a set of steps that wound down into the courtyard. Two of her personal guards kept a respectful distance. The courtyard itself was like a garden of impossibilities. The ground was covered in smooth stone that reflected the sky in watery patterns, and the foliage bristled with dark leaves that shimmered at the edges. In the center rose a statue of some ancient Xin forebear, arms outstretched, as though bestowing a blessing upon the land. She led me to a small platform on one side. It was scattered with objects I assumed were part of her daily routine. Training equipment with runic inscriptions, spools of unusual wire, and a device that looked like a spherical puzzle of layered metal. "You'll keep this area orderly. Ensure my equipment is maintained," she said. "I detest chaos, and you'll be ready at my call. Is that clear?" I nodded, biting back any acidic retort. If I was stuck here, I might as well observe and learn. Perhaps I could glean weaknesses in the palace's defenses or gain insight into her vulnerabilities. So I watched how she moved, how her guards stood at the perimeter, and how the corners of her eyes flinched when she breathed in, as though she was absorbing something unseen. Then she dismissed me with a flick of her hand, turning to speak to one of her guards in hushed tones. Days passed in a strained rhythm. I spent the mornings ensuring her training gear was set up, wooden staffs inlaid with swirling filaments, small orbs that pulsed faintly with psionic triggers, a collection of blades with wicked edges. She would practice, sometimes alone, sometimes with a guard or two sparring with her, and I was expected to stand by. My mechanical talents came into play in unexpected ways, especially when I recognized that certain devices were malfunctioning or had inefficiencies I could fix. I never said I was a mechanic outright, but old habits die hard. When I saw an opportunity to adjust the calibrations of a psionic amplifier, I did so without fanfare, and the results improved her training feedback. Her eyes flicked over me with new scrutiny, as though re-evaluating just who I was. Despite my outward compliance, my mind churned with half-conceived escape plans. I was always scanning corridors, noting guard schedules, checking possible infiltration points in the Dominion's architecture. But something else was happening too. I noticed small changes in her manner toward me. The snide remarks became less frequent, and a curiosity seemed to replace her default superiority when she'd catch me tinkering. One afternoon, when I was working on a malfunctioning orb that harnessed ambient psionic energy, she lingered a while, watching with arms folded. "You understand how that works?" she asked suddenly. I paused, a spanner in hand. "I've got a knack for technology," I said, trying not to sound too pleased. "Figured I'd see what was interfering with the conduction." I pointed to the overlapping plates on the orb. "They're out of alignment by a fraction of an inch. That's likely causing the feedback loop that makes it sputter." She shifted her weight, crossing her arms. "I'd been told you were just a rebel fighter." "A grunt." I shrugged. "Sometimes a grunt has to know how to fix what he breaks. We didn't always have specialized help on the front lines." Her lips pursed. She asked nothing else, but continued to watch me for a few minutes before leaving. I stared at her retreating form, thinking I caught a moment's hesitation, as though she wanted to say more. Still, I didn't dwell on it. My focus remained on regaining my freedom, on the ghosts that haunted me at night, reminding me of all I had lost. The tipping point came sooner than expected. Late one evening, while I was returning a set of newly sharpened blades to her training area, the entire palace seemed to shudder. A low rumble, like the grinding of massive stones, passed through the floors. I froze. The torches along the walls flickered wildly, and I heard frantic voices echoing from distant chambers. Something was wrong. I dashed through a side corridor, not sure why, only knowing that something had upended the usual rigid calm of this place. Sprinting around a corner, I nearly collided with one of the guards who had accompanied me earlier. His face was pale with alarm. "Assassins!" he gasped. "We're under attack." My heart hammered. Part of me wanted to rejoice at any turmoil that might create a diversion for my escape. But I also knew an assassin strike in the palace could be lethal chaos. And I suspected the target, the spoiled princess who had so many enemies. As if on cue, I heard a shriek and saw a flash of movement in the next hall. I bolted in that direction, half-formed plans swirling in my brain. If the princess was in danger, it might shift the balance of power, or at least give me a chance to exploit the confusion. My feet slid against the polished floor as I tore through the corridor. I found her surrounded by 3 assailants dressed in dark, close-fitting attire. They were closing in, Avari's hair was wild around her, the faint violet sheen in it catching the torchlight. Her eyes were narrowed, focusing her psionic energy. One of the attackers clutched his temple, clearly in pain, as she pressed her advantage. But the other two lunged, knives flashing. She dodged the first strike, but the second grazed her arm, slicing through the black sleeve and revealing a trail of shimmering fluid. She hissed in pain, and the subtle patterns under her skin flared in agitation. Without thinking, I charged forward, grabbing the nearest thing, a torch from the wall. I swung it at the attackers, the flames spitting sparks in the gloom. They spun to face me, momentarily losing their singular focus on her. She seized the moment, launching a precise psychic assault, which I felt as a pressure wave in the air. One of them staggered back, eyes rolling. The other, however, recovered quickly. He twisted past the flame I brandished, slashing a blade toward my midsection. I jerked back, but not fast enough. The blade kissed my side, leaving a burning streak of pain. Gasping, I dropped the torch, but I managed to push him off balance. Avari finished him with a well-placed palm strike that sent a resonant jolt into his body. He collapsed in a heap. The corridor reeked of burnt fabric and sweat. My heart hammered as I took stock. We had neutralized 3 assassins, but the flicker in Avari's eyes told me the danger wasn't over. She pressed her hand to her chest, breathing shakily. That same motion I'd seen before. "There could be more," she murmured. Her gaze then fell on me, noticing the way I clutched my side. I grit my teeth against the pain. Surprise and something akin to concern flickered across her features. "You fought for me," she said softly. "Why?" I half laughed, bitter and breathless. "I didn't like the idea of being assassinated with you." It was only half true. A deeper part of me, some stubborn moral code, refused to let her fall victim to a bloodbath while I stood aside. She looked at me more closely, and I saw her eyes shift from lilac to a deeper, almost bluish hue, as though her emotional currents were swirling. "Come on," she said. "We have to move." We half limped, half ran through corridors now filled with the distant clang of steel and the echo of shouting. Guards were in disarray, and flames crackled somewhere deeper in the palace. I didn't see a path to a safe exit. Then we heard a crash, and a contingent of unknown assailants swarmed in from a side hall, blocking our route. Avari's eyes narrowed. "We'll have to go down through the old passageways. There's an exit beneath the palace that leads outside." It wasn't lost on me that she was including me in that plan. We fled down a spiral staircase, the stone steps echoing with each footfall. My side ached, and every so often she stumbled, pressing her wounded arm close to her body. We both looked like battered refugees, the alien princess and her supposed slave. When we reached the bottom level, we found ourselves in a damp, musty chamber with an arched doorway leading into darkness. Avari paused, catching her breath, her face pale but resolute. "We'll have to go through the catacombs," she said quietly. "They haven't been used in centuries, but it's the only way out I'm sure isn't crawling with assassins." I wanted to question her, but survival overrode curiosity. With a curt nod, I gestured for her to lead on. Though the darkness was thick and oppressive, her eyes seemed to adjust better than mine. She stepped forward, and the veins beneath her skin flickered, providing the faintest semblance of luminescence. I wondered if that was intentional or just a side effect of her heightened adrenaline. Either way, it cast swirling shadows along the cold stone walls. This was no simple basement. Long tunnels stretched in multiple directions, stone corridors that felt older than the palace above. Stale air mingled with the smell of decay. Each step echoed ominously, and occasionally we heard distant rattling, perhaps the movement of ancient plumbing or shifting rock. Deeper and deeper we went, winding around corners where moss clung to damp stones. My thoughts churned with confusion. I was actually helping the princess, the very person who had claimed me as her slave. Yet, in a moment of lethal crisis, we had fought side by side, trusting each other enough to watch each other's back. It felt like an uneasy truce, born of necessity. Still, some part of me recognized the first hint of a connection beyond hatred. We were both survivors, forced together by circumstance. After what felt like an eternity, the corridor sloped upward, and we came upon a rusted metal grate. Avari tested it, wincing from the pain in her arm. "It should lead outside," she murmured. I braced my back against the wall and pushed, ignoring the sting in my side. The grate gave way with a loud screech, and a rush of fresh air hit us. We emerged onto a rocky plateau under the open sky. The fractured moon loomed overhead, its surface cracked into massive segments held together by gravitational forces or ancient engineering. The ground here was uneven, scattered with shards of black stone that reflected starlight. Strange, twisted plants with gnarled stems lined the edges of the plateau, giving the place an eerie silhouette. Avari took a few steps forward, breathing deeply, as if in disbelief that she had managed to escape. I scanned the area, noticing no immediate threat, though the possibility of assassins tracking us was high. She turned to me, face etched with conflicting emotions. A part of me expected her to snap back into her regal persona, ordering me around as if nothing had changed. But when she opened her mouth, the words came out differently. "They want me dead," she said, voice quiet. "Someone in my own court, likely with the blessing of those more powerful than me." A flicker of vulnerability passed over her face. But why risk a full-scale palace infiltration? I frowned, not sure if she wanted my input. "Politics?" I ventured. "Maybe they think you're a threat to someone's claim to power." My side twinged, and I remembered I was bleeding. Pressing a hand over the wound, I tried to hide my discomfort. She noticed, stepping closer, expression concerned despite herself. "Let me see." She reached toward my side, only to have me flinch away on reflex. Then I relented, letting her carefully peel back the torn fabric. She winced at the gash. "It's not mortal, but you'll need attention soon." I let out a weary laugh. "Where do you suggest we find medical care out here?" She studied the horizon, the glow of a distant ringed planet cresting low in the sky. "There's an old outpost not far from here," she said. "It hasn't been used in ages, but I believe it still has basic supplies." I caught a note of uncertainty in her voice, as if she'd never actually visited it. "We have no choice. If those assassins track us, we'll be easy prey in the open." "And your arm?" I asked, eyes flicking to the ragged slash on her sleeve. Her posture stiffened. "I'll manage." She turned, as though not wanting to reveal how much it hurt. We set off across the plateau, each step crunching over gravel and shards of obsidian-like rock. The air was thin and cold, filled with the faint taste of minerals. Occasionally, the breeze would carry the wail of wind through distant canyons, a haunting sound that settled in my bones. My mind spun with questions, but none of them found voice. For now, survival was paramount. She led, pausing now and then to look back at me, as though verifying I hadn't collapsed. Our footsteps fell into a rhythmic pattern, my boots scuffing the stones, her lighter steps leaving soft echoes in the stillness. Sometime later, we came upon a small structure nestled in the shadow of a rocky ridge. It was a low building made of the same pale stone as the palace, but worn by centuries of wind and weather. The door was barred, so I found a makeshift lever, an old metal pipe, and wedged it into the gap, heaving until the latch broke. Inside was pitch black, dust swirling in stale air. Something scurried away in the darkness. Avari placed her hand against the wall, and I saw those faint veins in her skin flicker, as though she was channeling her psionic sense to locate a power source. She found a panel near the entrance and pressed several glyphs. After a strained pause, a low hum reverberated in the building, and dim lights flickered to life. The space was modest. A single room with shelves, a cot in the corner, and a rusted cabinet that might have held old supplies. We wasted no time rummaging through the cabinets. Miraculously, I found a medkit with a wrap of antiseptic bandages and a few vials of coagulant agent. She insisted on helping me first, kneeling at my side while I peeled away the blood-soaked cloth from my torso. Her long, elegant fingers deftly applied the bandages, though I could tell her arm trembled from her own wound. I held in a hiss of pain, not wanting to appear weak in front of her, though she likely sensed my discomfort anyway. As she tied off the bandage, her gaze flicked to my face. "Rylan," she said softly, "thank you for fighting alongside me." The sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. I shrugged, grimacing. "Didn't do it for you," I lied. "Just didn't want to die in the crossfire." She studied me a moment, her expression unreadable, then gave a small nod. A sense of camaraderie, however fragile, sparked in that quiet moment. Next, I turned my attention to her injury, using what remained of the supplies to clean and dress the cut on her arm. The black material of her exosuit was sliced open, revealing the mesmerizing swirl of faint color beneath her skin. I tried not to stare, but it was unlike anything I'd seen in a human. There was something intimate about seeing her bare, alien flesh so closely. She watched me carefully, as if measuring my reaction. I tried to keep my expression neutral and just focused on cleaning and bandaging. "That should hold," I said, stepping back. "But we need to rest. Neither of us is in top form." She glanced around the outpost, noticing the dust-cloaked cot in the corner. There was only one, and it didn't look big enough for two people. We ended up clearing a space on the floor, gathering a few blankets from a storage trunk. The stale odor of old fabric made my nose wrinkle, but it was better than the cold ground outside. Exhaustion weighed on us. She laid down with her back against the wall, arms crossed protectively over her midsection, while I took the spot closer to the door, half laying, half sitting. We kept the lights dimmed. Silence stretched between us. My mind roiled with questions: who orchestrated the attack, how we would survive, and whether this uneasy partnership would last. I glanced at her, noticing her eyes had closed, though her brow remained furrowed. Something in me softened, recalling how she'd looked in the palace, a regal figure, confident to the point of arrogance. Now she was vulnerable, forced to rely on a human she'd once dismissed as a slave. I drifted into a restless sleep, broken by dreams of the palace corridors full of shadows and shifting patterns. When I woke, the faint light of an alien dawn filtered through cracks in the boarded windows. My side throbbed, but the bleeding had stopped. Avari was already awake, sitting on the cot with a distant look in her eyes. "Did you sense anything?" I asked quietly, still uncertain how her psionic abilities worked. She shook her head. "No sign of the assassins nearby. Not yet. But that doesn't mean they won't come." I nodded and rose, stretching stiff muscles. Outside, the sky was tinted a deep lavender, the fractured moon lowering in the horizon like a half-broken omen. In the corner of the outpost, I found a dusty console that might provide communications or scanning capabilities. It was ancient, but maybe I could rig it. Avari moved to help, offering what knowledge she had of its interface. It surprised me how willingly we collaborated, but necessity made us quick allies. She explained the console's language and glyphs, and I pried open a panel to reconnect severed wires. After a few moments of tinkering, the screen flickered, revealing a rough map of the surrounding region. It showed a wide expanse of jagged rock, a strange plain of crystalline sand, and farther north, a forest of black spires. The palace was a small dot behind us, and between us and civilization lay the unpredictable terrain of an ancient moon. Avari traced a route with her finger. "If we can navigate these plains, there's a settlement on the other side. It's small, but they might be sympathetic, or at least not outright hostile. My father's influence doesn't extend strongly that far." I arched an eyebrow. "You think your father might be behind this?" Her lips thinned, and she didn't answer right away. "Let's just say, those who would benefit from my demise could be closer to home than I ever imagined." A pang of hurt flickered across her features. I recognized it as the look of betrayal. She masked it quickly, turning her attention to the map. "We'll need supplies," she said, voice all business again. We spent the next hour rummaging through the outpost's storage, salvaging what we could. A few ration packs, some water filters, a small device that seemed to function as a shock baton if properly charged. Everything about Avari's stance suggested she was unsettled but determined. She instructed me on how to operate the baton, though I suspected my knowledge of more traditional weapons might come in handy sooner. The first leg of our journey took us across a wide plateau that gradually sloped into a valley shimmering with fine crystal sand. The sun, if that's what this star was, rose higher, turning the sky an unusual shade between turquoise and gold. The ground felt precarious beneath our feet, crunching in ways that made me wary of quicksand or sudden collapses. She was silent, stepping carefully. Occasionally, a shift in her expression told me she was testing the environment with her psionic sense, scanning for danger. I noticed the raw tension in her posture, a far cry from the aloof, arrogant princess I'd met. There was vulnerability in the way her shoulders stiffened, as if she was carrying more than just physical pain. "Hey," I said quietly, "you holding up?" The question surprised even me, sounding more concerned than I intended. She nodded curtly. "I'm fine." We trudged on. By midday, the heat rose off the sand in shimmering waves. Sweat beaded on my brow, and her normally cool expression showed faint signs of fatigue. That was when we heard a distant rumble. I glanced at her, and we halted, scanning the surroundings. A swirl of dust rose at the far edge of the valley. At first, I thought it was just wind. Then I saw it undulate in a strange pattern, like something enormous was moving beneath the surface. My stomach twisted. "What is that?" I asked under my breath. She drew a sharp breath. "Crystal serpents," she murmured. "They burrow beneath these sands. They're territorial and can sense vibrations." As if on cue, the swirling dust surged closer. "We have to move carefully," she added, voice laced with tension. "One wrong step and it'll surface." We exchanged a look. We had no weapons capable of taking on a creature that size. The only chance was to quietly navigate across this deadly terrain. My heart pounded as I tried to step lightly, distributing my weight with each footfall. Avari moved with a dancer's grace, but every so often a loose section of sand would shift under my boots, sending a small cascade. Each time, the swirling dust in the distance shuddered, as though trying to hone in on our location. It was a torturous process, crossing that valley at a snail's pace. I could feel the sting of sweat mingling with the pain at my side, and the dryness in my throat became almost unbearable. After an hour, we were nearly halfway across, with the swirling predator still lurking at the edge of our vision. Then, inevitably, a patch of sand gave way beneath me. I fell to one knee, and the sound of my tumble echoed across the quiet valley. Avari whirled around, eyes wide with alarm, but it was too late. The swirl of dust shot toward us. A faint hiss reverberated through the ground. Something massive was coming. My instincts kicked in. "Run!" I gasped. Together we sprinted, heedless of the noise, because stealth was no longer an option. The crystal serpent's approach sent waves rippling under our feet. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw the sand parting as a monstrous form surfaced. A serpentine body, shimmering with stone-like segments. Jaws lined with razor-sharp crystals that gleamed in the searing light. It let out a shriek that stung my ears, and I cursed under my breath, forcing my legs to move faster. Avari's psionic aura flared. I felt that familiar pressure in the air. The serpent's head jerked, its path faltering slightly. She was trying to disrupt its senses, to confuse it. But the creature was massive and furious, and my guess was that her powers were taxed from the earlier battle and her injury. Still, it gave us a window. The next 100 yards felt like miles, with the serpent thrashing behind us. Its tail whipped, sending a spray of glittering sand. One lash struck near me, and sharp shards scraped my exposed skin. At last, we reached a cluster of jagged rock jutting from the sand, a small refuge above the shifting ground. We scrambled onto it, breath ragged. The serpent coiled around the outcrop, hissing and shrieking, but it couldn't climb the smooth, steep surface. Avari knelt, pressing her palm to her chest, eyes shut tight in concentration. The serpent's thrashing slowed as she assaulted its senses again. After a few minutes of this combined intimidation, her psionic interference and the vantage we held, the creature retreated back into the sands with a final hiss, leaving us panting on the rocks. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The hush was broken only by our labored breathing and the distant whisper of wind over the desert. Then I found a wry chuckle forcing its way up my throat. "So this is the typical day in your dominion, princess?" She managed a faint smile, though it was laced with exhaustion. "Hardly. I usually have an entourage of guards who keep me safe from such creatures." I felt a spike of emotion at her mention of guards. They were likely dead or scattered, victims of the palace infiltration. We were alone now, forced to rely on each other. That realization sank in deeper than before, and I saw a similar awareness in her gaze. She looked at me, eyes shifting from lilac to a muted blue. "Thank you," she said softly. "Your quick reaction probably saved us." She had thanked me before, but this time it felt more genuine. I nodded, swallowing hard. "We need to find shelter for tonight," I said, surveying the horizon, "preferably somewhere without giant crystal serpents." She exhaled a slight laugh, and for a moment we shared a flicker of camaraderie. Then we pressed on, more carefully now. We skirted the edge of the valley, using rocky outcroppings to keep ourselves above the treacherous sands. The day wore on, and by evening we reached a ridge overlooking a canyon. The setting star bathed the sky in hues of burnt orange and lavender. Below us, I spotted a series of caves carved into the canyon walls, maybe the remnants of old water flow or geological shifts. We chose a cave higher up, hoping it would be out of the reach of predators. Inside, the cave was dark but blessedly cool. We used a few scraps of dry foliage found outside as tinder and started a small fire near the entrance. Avari sat down, pressing her back against the smooth stone, wincing at the pull of her injury. I retrieved one of the ration packs we'd salvaged. It tasted like stale crackers and something vaguely protein-based, but it was enough. She ate in silence, eyes distant. As the firelight flickered across the cave walls, I caught the subtle luminescence in her skin. The faint lines resembled branching tributaries of molten ore. I realized I was staring and cleared my throat. "Those patterns, they shift with your emotions, don't they?" I asked, trying for casual conversation, though a part of me was genuinely fascinated. She lowered her gaze, something vulnerable flashing in her eyes. "Yes, it's a trait of my kind. We perceive emotions differently as tactile sensations. When they're strong, it manifests in our skin." She paused, then added in a subdued tone, "I was raised to control them, to hide them, but it's not always easy." I nodded, feeling a flicker of empathy. "You've been under a lot of stress. Hard to keep a grip on that, I imagine." A faint smirk tugged at her lips. "I think anyone would be stressed if they were almost assassinated and then chased by a desert serpent." Her tone lightened slightly, a shimmer of humor amid the tension. The fire crackled, and for a time we let the silence stretch, taking in the warmth. Then she looked at me and her voice softened. "You carry your own burdens. I can feel them, you know. When you're caught in guilt or regret, it radiates." She pressed a hand to her chest. "It's like a pressure that wells up and echoes against my own heart." My instinct was to dismiss it, but her eyes were earnest. Slowly, I released a breath. "I lost people," I admitted, "people who trusted me to lead them on a mission. I miscalculated, or maybe I was just unlucky. Either way, they died, and I'm still here." The words tasted raw, but I continued. "That's why I ended up captured. I stuck around, trying to salvage something. It cost me my freedom." She reached out tentatively, her long fingers hovering near my arm. "I'm sorry," she said, and her sincerity seemed genuine. When her hand finally settled on my forearm, there was a gentle warmth there. An alien comfort, but comfort all the same. You didn't strike me as the type who'd hesitate to protect those under you. Maybe you're bearing too much responsibility for something that wasn't entirely in your control. I let out a bitter chuckle. Maybe. But that doesn't make the nightmares stop. We lapsed into silence again. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cave walls. Eventually, she scooted closer, seeking more warmth. I could see the tension in her face, lines of worry that no princess's privileges could erase. I was sheltered, she confessed, surprising me. I've had everything handed to me, but that meant I never truly learned what it's like to stand on my own. I was taught to see humans as inferior, to keep them at a distance. But in a single day, all of that feels trivial. I'm realizing how fragile my supposed power really is. The air between us felt charged, a collision of confessions. Vulnerability poured from both sides, weaving a fragile bond. I could almost feel her emotions brushing against me, a gentle current that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Without conscious thought, I lifted my hand and placed it over hers. The cave was silent, save for the fire crackling. That night we slept near each other, not quite touching, but sharing the meager warmth of the fire. I drifted off with a swirl of confusing thoughts. She was my captor, my so-called owner, yet now she was just as lost as I was. The world outside the palace's walls was harsh and ruthless, and we needed one another to survive. As much as I wanted to hate her, a seed of respect or something deeper was taking root. And in those moments, I couldn't deny the faint thrill that came from standing beside someone so different, yet so vividly alive. We rose at dawn. The sky was streaked with pink and crimson near the horizon, and the canyon below us glowed like embers in the early light. My side ached, and her arm must have pained her, but we packed our sparse belongings and pressed forward, climbing down into the canyon. She led, using her heightened senses to scan for potential threats, and I followed, scanning for a safe path across the rocky terrain. Not long into our descent, we heard a distant roar, different from the serpent's hiss. It came from somewhere deeper in the canyon. The walls echoed it back, making it hard to pinpoint. We moved carefully, avoiding precarious ledges and loose gravel. Our caution was rewarded when we found ourselves at a vantage point overlooking the canyon floor. There, prowling among the rocks, was a creature about the size of a small vehicle. Its skin resembled ridged slate, marked by lines of dull silver, and it moved on 4 legs that ended in barbed claws. The head reminded me of a feline predator, except the eyes were set wide apart, each glinting like a piece of polished stone. It paced slowly, sniffing the air. Avari crouched, motioning for me to do the same. She exhaled softly, her breath trembling. "That's a chasm prowler," she whispered. "They're relentless hunters." I peered over the edge, thinking if it's between us and where we need to go, we have a problem. Any way around? She shook her head. We could try to climb higher and bypass it, but that would cost us hours, and we'd still risk it noticing us. I studied the creature. It looked strong, built for bursts of speed. My heart thudded. Part of me thought about using the baton or some improvised trap, but that would likely end in bloodshed. Then I remembered her psionic abilities. "Could you distract it again?" She hesitated, pressing her palm to her chest in that telling gesture. "I can, but it's dangerous. If it senses me in its mind, it might rage. These creatures are known to resist psionic influence. I can create a short window of confusion, though." It was a risk we might have to take. We exchanged determined looks, and I nodded. Together, we crept along the ledge, each careful step placing us closer to the rocky slope that led down to the canyon floor. The prowler's ears twitched as it continued to sniff around. My heart hammered, remembering how easily a startled predator can turn deadly. We found a vantage point behind a cluster of boulders. The plan was simple and terrifying. I'd stir up a small disturbance off to one side, hopefully drawing the prowler's attention. Then, Avari would use her psionic resonance to confuse it, buying us time to skirt around and continue our journey. Quietly, I slipped away from her, crawling behind rocks to a position a little farther from the prowler. I grabbed a stone and hurled it into a pile of smaller rocks. They clattered, echoing loudly in the still air. The prowler's head snapped toward the noise, a low rumble rising from its throat. At that moment I felt a subtle shift in the air, like a faint hum pressing against my ears. Avari was channeling her power. The prowler's posture changed, its back legs bent awkwardly, as though it had lost sense of balance. It shook its head side to side, letting out a pained snarl. Immediately I started moving around the perimeter, my breath locked in my throat. Avari flanked me, also creeping at the creature's periphery. If we could just get past without it zeroing in on us, we might be home free. But halfway through, the prowler roared and snapped its head in our direction. Avari groaned softly, hand pressed to her chest, indicating she was struggling to maintain the psionic effect. The prowler advanced in a stumbling gait. We both froze. I clutched the baton, though I had no illusions about how effective it might be against such a beast. Then miraculously, the prowler halted, head twitching. It snarled in confusion, turning its attention to a cluster of rocks behind it. Not wasting a second, we dashed behind a boulder and up the next incline, hearts pounding. Once we put sufficient distance between ourselves and the prowler, we collapsed onto a narrow ledge, breath ragged. Avari's eyes were half-lidded, her skin's subtle patterns flickering in disarray. I could tell she had overextended her powers. I gripped her shoulder gently. "Come on, we can rest once we're out of its territory." She nodded weakly, and we continued the arduous climb. Eventually, the canyon walls opened onto a rolling plain of black shale and occasional patches of strange, greenish shrubs. We collapsed behind a rocky protrusion, draining the last of our water. The day was wearing on, and a chill wind picked up. We realized we needed better shelter. And soon. She consulted the map display on a handheld device we'd salvaged. "There's a small settlement about 5 miles from here," she announced. "We can reach it by nightfall if we push." I agreed, and we rose again, battered but resolute. As we walked, the conversation came easier. We told half stories of our lives, how she had grown up in the palace, groomed for leadership, rarely leaving the capital city. How I had drifted from one star system to another, picking up mechanical skills and eventually joining the rebellion. Each tale was incomplete, guarded, but we shared enough to recognize the gulf that separated us was slowly narrowing. She even offered a wry smile when I recounted my first attempts at forging weapons from junk parts. Night crept in, the sky once again dominated by the fractured moon. Its segments glowed faintly, the chasms on its surface illuminated by the reflection of a distant sun. The settlement finally appeared, a small cluster of structures nestled against the base of a towering, onyx-colored cliff. Warm light glimmered through a few windows, a welcome sign of civilization in this harsh land. My heart lifted at the prospect of rest, food, and maybe some answers. But that hope was tempered by caution. We had no idea how we'd be received. Avari was clearly royalty, her posture alone giving her away. My clothes, though once regal attire, were dirty and torn. In short, we were not exactly inconspicuous. As we approached, a tall, stocky figure emerged from the settlement's edge, holding a lantern. He looked us over, his brows lifting when he saw Avari's regal bearing. We braced for hostility. Instead, he simply beckoned us inside, as though travelers passing through was no big event. Perhaps the outer edges of the Dominion had grown accustomed to all manner of strangers. He introduced himself as Kiaru, a tradesman who ran a small supply depot. At first, he was guarded, but the moment he recognized the subtle patterns on Avari's skin, I saw apprehension in his eyes. Nevertheless, he invited us into a spacious but sparsely furnished building. The walls were made of local stone, and the roof was a patchwork of scavenged metal plates. We sat near a crude stove that radiated welcome warmth. "What brings the Princess of the Xyn Dominion out here?" Kiaru asked, his tone neither deferential nor hostile. more curious than anything. Avari hesitated, the weight of recent events evident in her expression. "We're traveling," she said carefully. "We need a place to rest, resupply." Kiaru eyed me as I warmed my hands. And the human? I fought the urge to bristle at being referred to so dismissively, but Avari surprised me. "He's with me," she said, her voice calm. "We're partners." The word hung in the air, partners. It was such a simple term, but it carried a world of meaning. Kiaru's brow furrowed, but he shrugged. "Your credits are good here, or whatever currency you carry," he said. "We have a few vacant rooms, enough for the night." We settled in an old storage room that had been converted into a makeshift bedroom. There were 2 cots with rough bedding, not exactly luxury, but better than the caves. A small lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls. I set down my gear, and Avari did the same, her movement slower than usual, likely still recovering from her exertion. Once the door was shut, a thick tension filled the space. "Partners," I echoed quietly, removing the last of my torn shirt. My side looked better, though the bandages needed changing. "Is that what we are now?" She paused, studying me. The subtle glow under her skin had softened, rippling with an emotional undercurrent I sensed was apprehension and something else. "You saved my life," she said, stepping closer. "Twice, in fact, and I fought for yours. We've crossed a desert and a canyon together. We bled together, Rylan, whatever titles once separated us. It feels irrelevant now." I released a long breath. "That's a big shift from calling me your slave." Her gaze wavered. "I was wrong. I didn't understand. I never understood what it meant to stand eye to eye with someone, to see them not as lesser, but as worthy of my respect." Emotions churned in my chest. Anger, relief, curiosity, attraction. I recalled those first days in the palace, how she'd looked at me like I was beneath her. Now she stood close, her lips parted, eyes filled with the reflection of the lamp's glow. My pulse quickened. "Things have changed," I said, the words heavier than they sounded. Her hand rose, hovering at my cheek. I could feel a faint warmth emanating from her skin, those swirling patterns shifting in the dim light. I remembered how she'd told me her species experiences emotional energy as a tactile sensation. I wondered what she felt in this moment. Slowly, she closed that final gap, her fingertips brushing the stubble along my jaw. The touch sent a shiver through me. My own hand lifted to her waist, feeling the curve of her body beneath the tight exosuit. We stood like that for a breathless span of heartbeats. Then, as if an unspoken agreement passed between us, we leaned in. Our lips met, tentative at first. A soft intake of breath came from her. My side throbbed with lingering pain, but it was drowned out by the heady rush of closeness. She pressed against me, mouth opening in a silent invitation, her alien warmth mingling with my own. I tasted her fear, her relief, her gratitude, and I sensed she tasted mine. The faint hum in the air hinted that her psionic senses were fully engaged, weaving our shared emotions into something deeper. Her arms wrapped around my shoulders, careful of my injury. I pulled her closer, letting the tension of the past days melt into that kiss. My mind reeled, grappling with the surrealism of it all. This was the same woman who'd declared me her property, and I was the man who swore I'd never bow to her or her empire. Yet here we were, pressed chest to chest in a borrowed room, a slow burn of desire awakening in the aftermath of survival. When we finally broke apart, our breathing was ragged. Her gaze was soft, eyes reflecting shades of amethyst and sapphire. My body hummed, every nerve alive with the intensity of the moment. She lowered her forehead against mine. "I'm not sure what comes next," she whispered. My hand slid down to the small of her back, feeling the trembling in her muscles. "We survive," I replied, voice thick, "and we figure it out together." Silence again, punctuated by the sound of our breathing. Then her mouth found mine once more. A sweeter kiss this time, but laced with lingering passion. The possibility of true intimacy loomed, a trembling question of whether we'd allow ourselves that step. Memories of my fallen comrades flickered in my mind, the weight of guilt, but something about her presence pushed that darkness back. She pulled away slightly, her lips brushing my ear. This world, it's harsh. I want... She hesitated, words caught in her throat. She didn't have to finish. I sensed it in the air, and my own desire rose to meet hers. I slipped my arm around her waist, guiding her toward one of the cots. Outside, the faint murmurs of other settlers drifted in, the shuffle of footsteps in corridors, the hum of distant machinery. But in that moment, it was just the two of us, and the swirl of unspoken need. Her fingertips traced the bandage at my side, cautious but intent, and I sucked in a breath at the featherlight touch. She brought her lips to my neck, trailing soft, tentative kisses. Each contact lit a spark in my veins, chasing away exhaustion and pain. She pressed me down onto the cot, careful but insistent. I tangled my fingers in her hair, feeling that surprising streak of violet in it shift with the change in angle. Our breaths mingled, and we shared a moment of eye contact. A question, an answer, a mutual consent. Then I let the tension that had built for days spill out in that intimate dance. Each layer of clothing peeled away with a sense of reverence. I drank in her alien beauty, the patterns beneath her skin, almost pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She traced the line of my scarred torso, stopping at the fresh bandages to be gentle. Tenderness and urgency collided in a wave that felt both daunting and inevitable. When our bodies came together, it was with a mixture of cautious discovery and raw need. The small lamp flickered, casting fleeting shadows over the walls. Every quiet gasp, every shift of limbs, carried an undercurrent of relief that for a brief time we could forget the danger waiting outside. The ache in my side occasionally spiked, but her careful touch and the surge of connection overshadowed the pain. I heard her whispered exhales, her voice pitching soft and breathy, each breath fanning the heat between us. At times, I almost sensed her psionic energy brushing my consciousness, a teasing static that ebbed and flowed with the rhythm of our coupling. The room warmed with our shared heat, and the unsteady flicker of the lamp felt like it pulsed in synchronicity with our hearts. At some point, I let out a low groan, half pleasure, half pain, and she paused, concern flooding her expression. I reassured her with a gentle pull, urging her back into the moment, needing that closeness more than anything. We moved together in a slow crescendo, building from tentative touches to a deeper, more urgent pace, letting the emotional weight of our shared hardships elevate the experience beyond mere physicality. Her nails, those translucent onyx-like tips, pressed lightly into my shoulders, sending electric shivers down my spine. When the tension finally broke, it did so with a quiet, potent intensity that left us breathing fast and clinging to each other. She collapsed against my chest, her heartbeat pounding in her ribcage. I felt her lips tremble against my neck. My own chest heaved as I struggled to steady my pulse. The lamp flickered one last time before it guttered out, leaving us in soft darkness. I stroked her hair, feeling the shift of color even in the shadows. She nestled closer, her breath warm against my collarbone. We lay like that for a while, letting the aftermath of pleasure and relief settle. My thoughts drifted, marveling at the abrupt shift in our dynamic. Hours ago, we were merely allies by circumstance, bruised and on the run. Now we had crossed a threshold of intimacy that made the rest of the world feel distant. Eventually we drifted into sleep, lulled by the soft hush of night in the settlement. Morning arrived with a muted glow seeping through the cracks in the walls. The settlement was already stirring, voices outside, the grind of machinery, the shuffle of footsteps. We disentangled from each other, stiff and sore but oddly content. My side burned with renewed ache, reminding me I was far from healed. She rose, slipping back into the remnants of her exosuit, while I bandaged myself anew. We exchanged small, private smiles, still flush with the memory of the night before. Yet reality quickly intruded. We needed to keep moving. The palace assassins wouldn't stop just because we'd found a brief haven. Over a meager breakfast, some local root vegetable stew courtesy of Kiaru, we discussed our next move. Word had spread that someone high-ranking was wandering these outskirts, and we feared it wouldn't be long before it reached the wrong ears. Avari wanted to confront the source of the assassination order, but we had no direct proof that it was her father. I suggested we find a safer vantage point, maybe gather intel from those who had reason to hate the Dominion. She agreed, though I sensed the torment behind her eyes. She didn't want to believe that her own blood would betray her. After breakfast, we thanked Kiaru for his hospitality and traded what little we had for supplies. More bandages, a water filter, and a battered old firearm that looked like it might jam at any moment. It was better than nothing. Then we continued on foot, heading toward a region of low hills that dotted the horizon. According to a battered sign outside the settlement, these hills were rich in mineral deposits and had once been mined extensively. Avari theorized that some of the older mine shafts might still exist, offering discreet travel routes. The weather changed as we ventured deeper. Clouds gathered, turning the sky into an iron-grey canopy. Gusts of wind picked up, biting through our clothes. Eventually, the drizzle turned into a steady rain, making the black shale slippery underfoot. We pressed on, but the rising wind and pounding rain forced us to seek shelter in a shallow cave near the crest of a hill. Huddled inside, we shared body heat, shivering as the storm raged outside. It felt reminiscent of the desert serpent encounter, just another harsh trial from this unforgiving moon. As night descended, the storm showed no sign of relenting. She rested her head on my shoulder, and I draped a cloak around us both. "We can wait out the worst of it," I said, voice nearly drowned by the roar of rain. She nodded, expression pensive. Hours passed in a blur of howling wind, but in that claustrophobic space, we shared more confessions. She told me about her childhood, how every choice was made for her, every lesson hammered in with the weight of royal duty. She spoke of the terror that had gripped her the first time she realized her father expected her to uphold the Dominion's ruthless policies. "I tried to speak out once," she said, voice trembling in the darkness. "He had the guards lock me in an isolation chamber for a week. After that, I complied. I convinced myself it was for the best." My chest tightened with anger at her father's cruelty. "I had no idea," I murmured, my hand tightening around hers. She pressed her face into my shoulder, and I stroked her hair gently. The motion meant to calm us both. Another layer of our barriers fell away, leaving a raw closeness that transcended the differences in our species or backgrounds. Eventually, the storm eased to a steady drizzle, and at the first break of dawn, we emerged from the cave, stiff and sore. The ground was slick, dotted with puddles that reflected the bruised sky. We trudged downhill, letting gravity guide us. The wind carried a metallic tang. Avari's expression grew more alert, and she paused, scanning the distance. I followed her gaze to a distant flash of movement, a group of figures picking their way across the ridge. They seemed armed, though it was hard to tell in the gloom. Instinctive dread settled in my gut. We ducked behind a crag, watching as the figures spread out, as if looking for tracks. My heart pounded. Could these be assassins? Bounty hunters? Either way, encountering them would be risky. Avari closed her eyes briefly, a sheen of light rippling beneath her skin. She was using her psionic sense to probe their intentions. Her eyes opened, wide with alarm. "They've come for me," she whispered. We retreated as quietly as possible, skirting the edge of a ravine. Every step we took squelched in the wet ground, threatening to give us away. The distant figures moved systematically, scanning for signs of life. At one point, a shout echoed, making us freeze. We pressed ourselves against the slick stone, hearts hammering. After a tense minute, the voices drifted away. We took the opportunity to slip into a narrow fissure that opened into a hidden path. The hidden path eventually led us out of the hills and onto a wide expanse of rolling grass-like vegetation. The air felt cooler here, the ground less rocky. Tall, slender stalks of dark green swayed around us, some bearing luminous droplets that clung to the leaves like miniature lanterns. Their glow was subtle and ethereal, reminiscent of moonlight, refracted through crystal. We moved silently, taking advantage of the cover. The grasses towered above our heads, forming a natural maze. At the heart of this grassland, we encountered a shallow stream. Our boots sank into the soft mud at its banks, and we paused to refill water and catch our breath. The tension of being hunted gnawed at me, but we had a temporary reprieve. Avari knelt by the water, cupping a hand to drink. She glanced at me, her expression troubled. "I sensed something else when I touched their minds," she murmured. "They're not just after me. They want to ensure I never return to the palace, alive or dead." She swallowed hard, shoulders sagging. The realization solidified my earlier suspicions. Perhaps her father had allowed or even orchestrated this. I felt anger coil in my chest, but I reminded myself to keep calm for her sake. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll keep moving," I said firmly. "We'll find a safe place to regroup, maybe warn others about what's going on." She shook her head, tears threatening to fall. "Warn who? My father has the entire dominion at his command. If he's turned against me, the only allies I might find are dissidents, rebels, criminals, and even they might not trust me." I tightened my jaw. "I was a rebel," I reminded her. "Look at us now." A faint, sad smile tugged at her lips. I squeezed her shoulder. "There's always a way, Avari. I don't believe in lost causes anymore." We followed the stream downstream, letting it guide us through the dense grass. Sunset approached, painting the sky in washes of gold and violet. I noticed how the droplet-like lanterns on the plants caught that light, creating a surreal glow that enveloped us. For a moment, it felt almost peaceful, if we ignored the fact that armed assassins were presumably on our trail. As dusk deepened, we found a small thicket where the grass had parted around a cluster of low bushes with broad leaves. It offered partial shelter, and we decided to rest there for the night. Avari built a small fire from dried stalks, while I used the water filter to fill our canteens. Then we sat close, arms occasionally brushing, letting the warmth of the flames soothe our chill. The memory of the night we'd spent together in that settlement room lingered between us, an unspoken promise of what might happen if we allowed ourselves to be vulnerable again. I watched her across the flickering glow, marveling at the duality in her features, the proud, regal lines of her cheeks and the gentle exhaustion that marred her expression. She met my gaze, and her skin's faint patterns stirred in subtle arcs, revealing her heightened emotion. "You're so different from me," she whispered. "Everything I was taught conflicts with what I'm feeling now." I shifted closer, taking her hand in mine. "If the old ways have only brought you pain, maybe it's time to abandon them." She drew a shaky breath. "I'm not sure if I can, or if I even know how." I brushed a strand of dark hair away from her face. "Then we'll figure it out together." My heart pounded, the intimacy between us growing thick in the air. Memories of the last time we were close flashed through my mind. The tension, the release, the surge of emotion. I saw the same recollection in her eyes, a heat that belied the cold wind, stirring the grasses around us. A ghost of a smile curved her lips. Her hand settled on my thigh, and my pulse kicked up. "Is it wrong to crave a moment of solace?" she asked, in a voice that wavered with vulnerability. In answer, I pulled her gently against me, our cloaks rustling as we settled near the fire. We shared a soft kiss, one that carried the weight of all we had endured, near-death experiences, betrayal, the forging of a fragile alliance. Her lips parted, and I felt the soft, familiar rush of her breath. The tension between us built quickly, fueled by the lingering adrenaline and the comfort of temporary safety. We sank onto the blankets we'd spread over the grass, bodies tangling in the firelight. Every touch felt electric, a reprieve from the constant danger. She explored my scars with gentle fingers, and I traced the swirling lines beneath her skin, each contact igniting new sparks of desire. When her clothes fell away, I admired the interplay of light across her alien beauty, those faint metallic hints that rippled with every shift of emotion. She unfastened what remained of my garments, leaning in to press a series of soft kisses along my collarbone. My breath caught, and I responded by sliding my hand along her spine, feeling the flutter of tension in her muscles. The second time we came together was both more urgent and more tender. We let the fear and uncertainty of our predicament fuel our passion, clinging to each other as if these moments were an oasis in a desert of dangers. I marveled at the softness of her skin, tempered by the muscle beneath, and how her sighs shivered against my ear. We moved with a shared rhythm, learning each other's cues, each subtle shift of hips or arch of back. At times, the wind outside seemed to howl, as if reminding us of our precarious situation, but we lost ourselves in each other until the flames burned low. When we finally stilled, she rested her head on my chest, her body rising and falling with my unsteady breath. I stared at the stars through the break in the grass canopy, letting the enormity of the sky wash over me. With her warmth pressed against me, I felt a sense of belonging that I hadn't experienced in years. Sleep overtook us in that tranquil hush. The morning arrived with a crisp chill and a faint rustling of grass in the breeze. We dressed in silence, exchanging soft glances laden with unspoken affection, but we also knew it was time to keep moving. The further we could get from the hills, the better our chance of slipping past the assassins. By midday, we reached an area where the grass thinned, and in the distance we spotted jagged outcrops of some crystalline rock. The landscape was ever shifting, reminding me how alien this moon really was. We were discussing our path forward when the ground trembled beneath us. I heard a low groan, like the shifting of tectonic plates. Ahead, cracks raced through the earth, and a spire of crystalline rock collapsed. Shocked, we staggered back. The tremor lasted only seconds, but it was enough to send plumes of dust rising into the air. When it settled, we saw that the path we intended to take was partially blocked by fallen debris. Avari cursed softly. We had no choice but to detour around the fresh rubble. This took us along a route that wound through narrow canyons of crystal shards, jutting from the ground at odd angles. The shards shone like fractured glass, each catching the sunlight in glitters of rainbow refraction. It might have been beautiful if not for the razor-sharp edges that threatened to shred our boots and clothes. Carefully, we navigated the labyrinth, with me using a metal rod to test uncertain areas. Halfway through, we noticed footprints, fresh ones, leading into the maze of crystal. My spine prickled. Were the assassins ahead of us? Avari motioned for caution, and we proceeded slowly, hearts pounding. The maze opened into a wide clearing, surrounded by towering columns of crystal. At the far side, we spotted 3 armed figures, scanning the area with weapons at the ready. The assassins. They hadn't noticed us yet, but there was no easy way to slip past them. My grip tightened on the battered firearm we'd acquired. I glanced at Avari. She nodded, lips pressed thin. We moved in tandem, trying to circle around their flank without being seen. Just as we were about to make it past, a crystal shard under my foot cracked with a sharp echo. One of the assassins spun around, shouting an alarm. Instantly they opened fire, bolts of energy ricocheting off the crystal columns in a dazzling but deadly display. We dove behind an outcrop, panting. Avari closed her eyes, trying to channel her psionic ability. A wave of pressure emanated from her, distorting the air. One assassin doubled over, clutching his head, but the other 2 pressed on. I popped up from behind cover, firing a few rounds from the old gun. The recoil nearly knocked it from my hands, and I wasn't sure I'd hit anything. They returned fire, scorching the crystal near my face. Shards exploded, cutting my cheek with tiny lacerations. Avari's second psionic assault disrupted another assailant, making him stagger. I seized the chance to rush forward, baton in hand. With an adrenaline-fueled burst, I slammed it into his midsection, sending a jolting shock that dropped him. But the last assassin was already pivoting, leveling his weapon at me. My stomach lurched. I had no cover. Then Avari appeared at his side, arm lashing out in a blurred strike. Her hand glowed faintly, and the assassin howled, stumbling. I tackled him to the ground, disarming him. It was over in seconds, but the tremor in my limbs took far longer to subside. 3 assassins lay sprawled on the crystal floor, either unconscious or incapacitated. Avari leaned against a column, breathing heavily, sweat beading on her brow. I picked up one of the functioning weapons from the fallen attackers, my heart still pounding. That's when we heard a new sound, a slow clap echoing through the clearing. My blood turned to ice. A tall figure stepped into view, flanked by 2 more armed soldiers. His attire was more elaborate, featuring subtle details of rank and wealth. The face was one I recognized from glimpses in palace corridors. Lord Nerian, a close advisor to the royal family, and rumored to be a skilled psionic himself. His hair was as black as the void, and his gaze bored into us with cold amusement. "My dear princess," he said, bowing with mocking flourish, "how resourceful you are. I expected you to be cowering in some gutter by now." Avari's jaw clenched. "Nerian, so it was you all along?" He chuckled, but his eyes remained devoid of warmth. "Not just me, but I'm here to finish the job." He flicked his fingers, and the 2 soldiers leveled their weapons. "Hand yourself over, and I may let your pet human live." I tensed, but Avari's fierce expression didn't waver. She stepped forward, ignoring my attempt to hold her back. "You think killing me will secure your power base?" He shrugged. "Power is a delicate art. Your father's trust is wavering, and your ongoing existence complicates matters. The Dominion needs a strong hand, not a princess who shows mercy to rebels." He sneered at me. In response, Avari let out a slow, measured breath. I felt her energy swirling, a tangible force in the air. Nerian's eyes narrowed. He must have sensed it too, but he was prepared. He lifted his hands, summoning a psionic barrier or some counterforce. The air crackled with unseen tension, making my teeth vibrate. This was going to be a battle of wills, one I wasn't equipped to fight on the psychic level, yet I refused to stand idle. While they locked in a silent contest of mental strength, I edged sideways, raising the captured weapon. The 2 soldiers moved to intercept, and we exchanged fire. One of my shots clipped a soldier's shoulder, sending him reeling. The other fired back, forcing me behind a crystal outcrop that shattered under the impact. Each blast echoed in the clearing, the air thick with tension, and the acrid smell of discharged energy. Meanwhile, Avari and Nerian stood only a few feet apart, eyes locked, expressions twisted in concentration. I could see a faint shimmer around Avari, and her skin's patterns glowed with intense flares. Nerian's face contorted, sweat trickling down his temple. Their psychic duel was wreaking havoc. Some crystals around them vibrated, and cracks spiderwebbed through the columns. I managed to down one soldier, but the other closed in. He lunged at me, tackling me hard to the ground. My wounded side exploded in pain as we rolled over shards of crystal. I saw stars, struggling to keep hold of the gun. The soldier pinned me, pressing a forearm to my throat. My lungs burned. Desperate, I groped for the baton at my belt. My fingers brushed its handle, and I squeezed the trigger. The jolt made the soldier's body spasm. He collapsed off me, groaning. I coughed, drawing in sharp breaths, then forced myself to my feet. My vision swam. Just then, a psychic backlash thundered through the clearing. Avari cried out, staggering. Nerian grunted, looking equally drained, but a vicious grin spread across his lips. He advanced on her, conjuring a swirling vortex of pressure between his hands. She stumbled backward, dangerously close to the edge of a jagged drop in the crystal ground. I shouted her name, but she was too focused on resisting Nerian's assault. Summoning every ounce of adrenaline, I sprinted forward. Nerian turned, eyes widening. "Stay out of this, slave!" he snarled, unleashing a psychic blast. It hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. My knees buckled and the world tilted, but the sight of Avari, cornered, pushed me to keep going. I forced my body to obey. Each step felt like wading through quicksand. Blood pounded in my ears. At the final moment, I dove at Nerian, hooking my arm around his waist and driving him backward. The swirling vortex in his hands dissipated, and we crashed onto a cluster of crystals with a sickening crunch. He lashed out psionically, sending a jolt of searing pain through my skull. I gasped, vision momentarily going white, but I clung to him, determined to buy Avari any opportunity. She staggered forward, face pale, a line of blood trickling from her nose. Then her eyes flared, brilliance flooding her skin patterns. She placed a hand on Nerian's chest and let out a guttural cry. The force of her psionic burst reverberated through my bones. Nerian's eyes went wide with terror. He screamed, a piercing sound that echoed off the crystal walls, and then he went limp. I rolled off him, shaking from head to toe. She collapsed beside me, breathing in shallow gulps. For a moment, we just lay there, battered and disoriented. Then I sat up, pressing a palm to her cheek. "Hey, you okay?" My voice shook with worry. Her eyelids fluttered, and she looked up at me, an exhausted but relieved smile forming. I think so." She glanced at Nerian's unmoving form. "He won't be a threat anymore." Gingerly, I helped her to her feet, and we limped over to a chunk of crystal that formed a makeshift seat. Around us, the unconscious or incapacitated assassins lay sprawled. Blood smeared on my lips from the mental shock, but I ignored it, focusing on Avari. She clasped my hand, her skin's glow ebbing to a gentler shimmer. "That was reckless," she said, voice trembling. "You could have died." I managed a shaky grin. "Better me than you." Tears welled in her eyes. "No, never say that." She pulled me into a fierce embrace, ignoring the pain we both must have felt. For a time, we just held each other in the wreckage of the crystal clearing, hearts pounding with the realization that we were still alive. We needed to move before reinforcements arrived or something worse happened. Summoning our remaining strength, we gathered the least damaged weapons from the scene. One assassin groaned, regaining consciousness, but Avari fixed him with a cold stare that made him freeze in place. We left them behind, dragging ourselves out of the labyrinth, forging a path toward open ground. Each step was agony, but we pressed on, arms around each other for support. Night fell by the time we stumbled onto a wide plain of basalt rock, shot through with veins of dull metal. We found a deserted rock formation that provided some cover from the wind. There, under the light of the fractured moon, we sank to the ground. Our battered bodies ached in unison. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I exhaled, relief coursing through me. "You realize what this means," she whispered. "My father likely sanctioned Nerian's actions. I can't go back, not unless I confront him directly. And if I do, it will be a fight I might lose." I stroked her hair, my mind reeling from the day's events. "If he's behind this, then he's forfeited the right to your loyalty. Maybe you need to let the Dominion fall under its own corruption. Walk away. We can find somewhere else, somewhere safe." She shook her head. "Running forever doesn't feel right. I'm not saying I want the throne or to lead, but I can't let them continue their tyranny unchecked. I grew up thinking that was the only way. Now I know better." Her hand found mine. "But I won't do it alone." My heartbeat thudded in my chest. I thought of the rebels, of my lost friends. Could we spark change from within? The possibility was daunting, but if anyone had the credibility to challenge the Dominion, it was Avari. And with my knowledge of guerrilla tactics, maybe we stood a chance. "We stand together," I said, voice firm, though inside I quaked at the enormity of the task. She nodded, and the silence that felt like the calm before a necessary storm. Despite the swirling uncertainty, one thing felt solid: our connection. The night's chill made us press closer, seeking warmth in each other's arms. My head swam with memories of close calls, confessions, the shared intimacy that had bound us so tightly. In the flickering shadows cast by the fractured moon, I saw in her eyes a reflection of my own hope and fear. We drifted off to sleep, huddled under a battered cloak. My dreams were full of swirling colors, shifting alliances, and the sense of an impending final confrontation. Morning came too soon, and we awoke stiff and cold, yet determined. Over a meager meal, we hashed out a plan to return to the palace in secret, to confront her father. First, we needed to slip into a nearby settlement to gather intel and possibly recruit help. The notion of returning to the belly of the beast was terrifying, but a strange clarity guided us. The only way to end this was to face it head-on. The journey back across the plains took several days, each fraught with the possibility of more assassins. We kept to hidden routes as much as we could, using Avari's psionic sense to detect threats. The nights we spent in each other's arms, reaffirming our bond with whispered words and tender caresses. It was as though we drew strength from these intimate moments, fueling our resolve for the battles ahead. Eventually, the palace's spires appeared on the horizon, looming against a stormy sky. My stomach clenched at the memory of being dragged through those halls in chains. Avari's hand found mine, her grip reassuring. This time, we weren't sneaking in alone. We'd managed to connect with a ragtag group of rebels who still remembered my name, who still had reason to trust me. Though small in number, they were skilled, fueled by anger at the Dominion's oppression, and we had a secret weapon. A princess with a claim to the throne, determined to tear down the system if needed. Under cover of darkness, we infiltrated the palace's outskirts. My heart hammered as we slipped through hidden passageways, bypassing guard patrols. Once inside, the architecture felt both familiar and menacing. The domed ceilings and polished stone floors that once seemed so regal now harbored echoes of the violence we'd witnessed. Our small team split up, each with roles designed to distract, sabotage security, or hold key vantage points. Avari and I headed for the throne room, the place we suspected her father would be. Approaching the grand double doors, we found them guarded by 4 elite soldiers. The odds didn't look good, but Avari's psionic surge rattled them. She walked forward with regal confidence, the swirling glow under her skin blazing. 2 of the guards succumbed to confusion, collapsing to their knees. The other 2 raised their weapons, but I fired a volley of cover shots, forcing them to dive for cover. We seized that moment to push open the doors. Inside, the throne room stretched in a vast expanse of polished stone and carved pillars. Tall windows framed the stormy night outside. Torches and braziers illuminated an ornate seat on a raised dais, where Emperor Xyn'Valeth sat, flanked by his personal guard. He was older than I expected, with deep lines etched into his stern features, hair the same dark shade as Avari's, but streaked with silver. The patterns beneath his skin glowed faintly in a menacing hue. He rose slowly, expression impassive. "Avari," he said, voice echoing. "You've returned." She squared her shoulders, ignoring the pang of hurt that clearly shone in her eyes. "You sent assassins," she accused, voice carrying. "You tried to have your own daughter killed." The Emperor did not flinch. "You forced my hand. Your sympathies with lesser beings compromised our dominion. A strong ruler cannot tolerate weakness even in his own blood." My anger flared, and I stepped forward, but Avari stopped me with a subtle motion. She advanced on her father, eyes blazing. "You've taught me that power is everything, but all I see is fear. Fear of what I represent, change, compassion, a different path. You'd rather kill me than let me show there's another way." He sneered. "Spare me your moralizing. Surrender, and I might let your pet human survive as an exhibit of your folly." The tension in the air reached a breaking point. Avari's psionic aura flared, swirling arcs of light pulsing under her skin. The Emperor's own power rose in counterpoint. His personal guard rushed forward, but at that same moment, a commotion erupted in the corridors behind us. Our rebel allies had engaged the palace guards, the throne room filled with echoes of battle cries and weapons discharge. Avari and her father clashed in a confrontation of mental force that shook the very air. I ducked behind a pillar, exchanging fire with the Imperial guards. Columns cracked as stray bolts collided with stone. Each time I had a free moment, I'd glance toward Avari. She stood with arms raised, as though holding back a tidal wave. Her father advanced, purple arcs of psionic energy radiating from his hands. The tension formed a swirling maelstrom between them, sending dust and debris swirling across the throne room floor. Sensing the precarious balance, I darted around to flank the Emperor. One of his guards spotted me and tackled me with a body slam that sent me sprawling. We wrestled, trading blows. At one point, the guard's armored fist smashed into my jaw, causing stars to explode in my vision. Summoning the last of my strength, I drove my knee into his midsection, then slammed the butt of my gun into his helmet. The guard slumped. Across the hall, I saw Avari buckling, her father's power pressing her down. Her lips were curled in pain, blood trickling from her nose. "Avari," I shouted. Rage and desperation fueled me. I dove at the Emperor's side, aiming to disrupt his concentration. He sensed me, eyes flicking my way, and let loose a psionic wave that hurled me backward. Pain erupted as my back struck a column. I slid to the floor, gasping, but my distraction had served its purpose. Avari surged with renewed resolve. She let out a shout, raw emotion channeled into psychic strength. The Emperor's smug facade cracked. Their powers collided in an invisible storm that rattled the throne room. I watched in awe as Avari stepped forward, inch by inch, dominating the contest of wills. The Emperor's expression changed from disdain to alarm. "You are not fit to rule," she said, each word laced with fury and heartbreak. "You betrayed your own flesh and blood. That is not strength. It is cowardice." A final surge of psychic energy tore through the air. The Emperor roared, staggering back. His guard tried to intervene, but at that moment, the rebels stormed through the doors, overwhelming the last of the defenses. The Emperor sank to one knee, blood seeping from his eyes and ears, his own power turned against him by Avari's unstoppable wave. She stood before him, trembling with exhaustion, face streaked with tears. All around us, the fighting died down. The rebels secured the chamber, subduing any remaining loyalists. In that charged silence, Avari looked at her father. For a moment, I thought she might show him mercy, but she raised her hand, the glow beneath her skin intensifying. He closed his eyes, resignation etched into his features. With one final thrust of psionic force, she ended it. Emperor Xyn'Valeth collapsed, lifeless. A hush descended over the throne room, broken only by ragged breaths. Avari swayed, nearly dropping. I rushed to her side, catching her before she hit the floor. She sobbed into my shoulder, grief and relief mingling in a heart-wrenching cry. I held her, whispering that it was over, that she was safe. Around us, the rebels looked on in a mix of awe and uncertainty. The Dominion had lost its ruler. What came next was unclear. In the days that followed, a fragile new order began to take shape. Some of the palace staff fled, loyal to the old regime, but others recognized the moment for what it was, a chance for change. Avari refused the throne, instead advocating for a council to govern. She negotiated with rebel leaders, forging alliances that transcended old prejudices. It wasn't easy, and many still viewed her with suspicion, but her willingness to relinquish absolute power surprised them. Slowly, it won people over. I stayed by her side. She needed someone she could trust, and I'd found a cause worth fighting for. Together we dismantled the Dominion's oppressive laws, step by painstaking step. The palace was transformed into an administrative seat of a new coalition. Some worlds in the Dominion resisted, while others embraced the chance to shape their destinies. It was chaotic, messy work, but it felt right. A few weeks after the final battle, we found a moment of peace in a small balcony overlooking the palace gardens. The sky was streaked with the soft tones of sunset, and the air carried the scent of those twisted, black-leaved plants. Avari leaned against the railing, her hair blowing in the breeze, its violet sheen catching the fading light. Her eyes shimmered with a subdued contentment. I stepped up behind her, wrapping my arms around her waist. She sighed, relaxing into my embrace. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" she asked softly. I pressed a kiss to the back of her neck. "Not in a million years." She turned in my arms, facing me, her expression tender. We changed each other. "I'm not the same person I was when you were first brought before me in chains." I brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not the same either." I thought of the guilt I'd carried, the sense of failure that once haunted my every step. While I still mourned my lost comrades, I now had hope that their sacrifice might lead to a better future. "You gave me something to believe in again." She stood on her tiptoes, pressing a soft kiss to my lips. For a moment, we lingered like that, drawing comfort from each other. Then she took my hand, leading me inside, down corridors where the torchlight glinted off polished stone. Along the way, we passed people, former guards, new council members, rebels turned advisors, who were learning to coexist under this nascent order. Some nodded respectfully, others smiled in recognition. At last, we reached a smaller chamber near the palace's western tower. It was sparsely furnished, just a table, a bed, and a window overlooking the courtyard. But it was ours. Avari had chosen to reside here, rejecting the lavish royal suites in favor of a more humble space. We stepped inside, shutting the door behind us. The day's stress melted away, replaced by the warmth of being together. In the gentle glow of a single lamp, she turned to me, her eyes reflecting soft purples and blues. "No more battles, no more running," she whispered, "at least for tonight." I smiled, drawing her close. "For tonight," I agreed. The future would be full of challenges, but we had this moment, and we had each other. Outside, the fractured moon hung in the sky, its broken pieces once symbolic of a shattered dominion. Now I saw it as a reminder that even broken things can find a new shape, a new purpose. Avari and I had come from vastly different worlds. She, the spoiled alien princess, she the slave who refused to bow. And yet, here we stood, bound not by chains, but by a love forged through struggle and triumph. We had faced the worst this dominion could throw at us, and we'd survived. More than that, we'd changed it. She reached for my hand, guiding me gently toward the bed. I followed, every step echoing the journey we'd taken, from enemies to allies to something far deeper. Our story was one of broken paths, converging into a single road. As we settled into the soft sheets, I bent down to kiss her, letting gratitude and desire merge in that quiet darkness. She sighed against my lips, a sound of acceptance and promise. We might have more battles to fight in the coming days, but tonight we found solace in each other's arms. When at last we drifted into sleep, it was with the certainty that our journey was complete in one crucial sense. We had found what we needed in each other, and neither of us would face the future alone.